So welcome to everyone who's joining. We typically just wait a few minutes for latecomers before we give our official welcome. So thanks for your patience. Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Anne Glegg and I'm a professor of religion at the University of Central Florida.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Langenberg and I'm an associate professor of religion at Eckerd College, also in Florida.
Amy and I are the co-organizers of Abuse, Sex and the Sangha, a series of healing conversations. As many of you are aware, North American Buddhist communities have been the site of reoccurring sexual misconduct and abuse cases. This series of conversations brings together practitioners and scholars to examine multiple dimensions of abuse in Buddhist contexts and to articulate best practices for building safe and inclusive sanghas. Today is the third conversation in our series. Our topic is sexual abuse, whiteness and patriarchy. Our panelists are Lama Rod Owens and Dr. Shante Paradigm Smalls. We did have a third panelist, JoAnna Hardy. Unfortunately, JoAnna is ill and is unable to make it, so we wish her a speedy recovery. Our moderator today is Dr. Nalika Gajaweera. We have two upcoming conversations, one on comparative Buddhist sexual ethics in September, and another on sexual misconduct and legal liability issues in Buddhist sanghas in October. Our series is sponsored by the Religion and Sexual Abuse Project and funded in part by the Henry Luce Foundation. And you can find details of both the project and the upcoming talks in the chat box.
We want to acknowledge the reality and pervasiveness of sexual abuse. According to RAIN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest Network, which is the largest anti-sexual violence network in the US, an American is sexually assaulted every 73 seconds. 1 out of 6 women have been the victim of rape or attempted rape. 1 out of 33 men have been the victim of rape or attempted rape. 1 in 2 transgender individuals have been sexually abused or assaulted. Given these statistics, we recognize the likelihood that our audience today may include survivors of sexual assault. We wanted to signal that some of the material presented today might be distressing. We encourage you to do what you need to take care of yourself. We include the National Sexual Assault Online Hotline in the chat. We also We are also available if you want to check in after the talk. And we'll put our emails also in the chat. We want to thank survivors of sexual violence in Buddhist communities and beyond, whose feedback has been invaluable to us as we continue to work on this research. Finally, Anne is speaking today from the traditional territories of the Seminole and Miccosukee people, and I am speaking from the traditional territories of the Seminole and Tocobaga peoples. We want to acknowledge that there is an epidemic of sexual violence against Indigenous women. More than 1 out of 2 Native women have experienced sexual violence. Native Americans are twice as likely to experience a rape or sexual assault compared to all races. This series is free, but if you can we encourage you to support one of the organizations dedicated to ending sexual violence against Indigenous women from the Tribal Coalition. Before we introduce our moderator today, we have some housekeeping details. Anne and I are going to post some relevant links in the chat, as we already have, but the chat is going to be closed to the audience. For the Q&A, we have a special platform. It's called Slido. I'm going to put the information in the chat in 1 second. You're going to need the link to the Slido website plus the code for this event. We suggest that you open it in a second browser, and it will enable you to submit a question. You can submit questions anonymously, or you can do it with your name attached if you prefer. It also gives you, Slido gives you options to vote for questions that have been asked by others. So we suggest that when you submit your question, first take a look and see if there's another question that's similar to yours. And if so, you can vote on that one instead of adding. It will help us kind of curate and sort out the questions as we go. So if you like a question, it moves it up in the order of questions. We will prioritize the questions with the most votes, but also try to, as much as we can, honor a range of questions as well. And finally, we would like to thank Karen Myers at Buddhist Currents for hosting us. Karen is usually with us during the events, these events, but she couldn't make it today. We couldn't have done this series without her, and we encourage you all to check out her website for other events related to engaged Buddhism, and we're going to put that link also in the chat.
So we'd like to introduce you to our moderator today. We're really delighted to have Dr. Nalika Gajaweera with us. Dr. Nalika is a research anthropologist at the Center for Religion and Civic Culture at the University of Southern California. Her specializations are in the anthropology of religion, with a special interest in the intersections of Buddhism, race, ethno-nationalism, and gender. She has studied these issues most in depth in the context of Sri Lanka and the United States. Her current project focuses on documenting the struggles, experiences, and practices of ethnic and racial minority leadership within North American meditation-based insight institutions, and their efforts to confront issues of race, racism, and whiteness within these institutions. Her project is called Transforming the American Sangha. It's a 3-year research initiative supported by the Katali Foundation, and I'll put the links into the chat now. Thanks, Nali.
Thank you. Thanks, Anne, for the introduction. I'm excited to be part of this conversation and to be moderating. So a little introductions to our speakers today. Unfortunately, JoAnna Hardy is ill and we will be missing her, and we wish her good health. But with us today is Lama Rod Owens and Dr. Shante Paradigm Smalls. Lama Rod Owens is a Buddhist minister at the Harvard Divinity School, a best-selling author, activist, yoga instructor, and an authorized Lama of the all Buddhist teacher in the Kagyu School of Tibetan Buddhism. He is the co-author of Radical Dharma, Talking Race, Love and Liberation, as well as of Love and Rage, The Path to Liberation Through Anger, and the co-founder of Bhumi Parsha, a Buddhist tantric practice and study community. Dr. Shante Paradigm Smalls is a teacher and a student in the Vajrayana Tantric Buddhism, and is a teacher on the Liberate app, and is a lead teacher on the weekly Dharma gathering, which they co-founded and curate. So thanks, the both of you, for joining us in this conversation today, and I look forward to the conversation. So I would like to get us started today by diving right into the topic of the panel today, and ask you to tell us how you locate yourself in relationship to the issues of sexual abuse and its racial dimensions in the communities that you practice with and lead. I could start with, is there one of you who'd like to start first?
I volunteer, Shante.
So one of the things I'd like to say is Lama is one of my teachers. So you see how he's doing me, right? Okay. Yes, Lama La. I'll go. Thank you so much, Anne, Amy, and Nali. I had the pleasure of, I think, meeting and talking with Anne and Amy, and specifically maybe a couple of years ago, doing some interviews around this project, and then meeting them both in person at the Bhumi Sparsha December 2019 retreat in Atlanta. So I feel very honored to be on this panel. My name is Shante Paradigm Smalls. I use they, them pronouns. I'm calling in from Lenni Lenape, Munsey Canarsie land, also known as Brooklyn, New York. And my two teachers are Lama Rod Owens and Lama Justin von Budjas. And I no longer have a official Sangha that I'm a part of. It's really been an interesting journey, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But I practice with a number of emergent communities and Sanghas. So I wrote some things down because I wanted to speak directly to my experience at this juncture of sexual abuse, whiteness, and patriarchy inside the community to which I belonged for about 13 years, from 2006 to 2019. Although maybe some questions will come up about the retreat I attended last week through Open Tory, which is not a Shambhala. It's not anything. It's not any kind of organization, but it was a gathering to see if there's anything salvageable in terms of practice, which no, but I'll get back to that. Then I made a video about my experience, and that caused some anxiety because I talked about my experience with anti-Black racism, and I did not center sexual abuse because there was no sexual abuse that happened there. What the violence really was anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism and white supremacy. So, okay. I want to acknowledge that everything I would like to say today and everything I have said in the past 3 years relating to sexual abuse in Buddhist communities and whiteness and patriarchy cannot be said here today. Though I have spoken about Shambhala in particular and sexual assault in many places, and the most readily available teachings in which I talk about this throughout 2018 and 2019 are on podcasts on my website. So I can just throw that in the chat. And you can kind of hear the progression as I learn more information about what I say and what I don't say. I want to offer gratitude for all the survivors of sexual abuse, sexual violence, sexual harm, and harassment. I want to offer gratitude to the survivors of white supremacist violence, gaslighting, erasure, and abuse, and those who have survived all forms of patriarchal violence, abuse, and harm. Thank you for sharing your stories, your anger, your insights, and your truths. We did nothing to deserve this, and many times have driven you out of our communities with our defensiveness, unwillingness to listen, and our stridency. And since JoAnna Hardy is sick, please, think of our friend. I was really looking forward to hearing her. And not able to join us, I want to invoke the wisdom of Black women, since Black women are not represented on this panel. I'm a genderqueer person, even though I'm female-bodied. And since Black women are physically absent, though, of course, the ancestors are with us, I want to read this page, so just bear with me, from Love with Accountability. I'm digging up the root, and this is particularly about child sexual assault, but this particular chapter is about religion, the Black church. And this is edited by my good friend and also my Dharma student, Aisha Shahida Simmons. So this is from the least of these, a chapter on Black children's sexual abuse and theological malpractice by Ahmad Green Hayes. It is important to note that many of the terms used in my written and vocal work are terms that are never spoken in many Black religious spaces. Consent is assumed, but is never taught. Rape is alluded to, but is never acknowledged. The survivor is shunned, while the overcomer is praised. These terms, however, function as guiding principles in the fight to end sexual violence. I believe wholeheartedly that Black sexuality, gender identity, and sexual violence cannot be freely and expressly understood or discussed within Black churches until the church catches up to the mainstream discourse on human sexuality, and even the mainstream discourse lags behind those who are survivors, queer, trans, women, and femme. These words are prominent in social justice spaces, anti-rape organizations, and in other medical and legal entities, but they are often absent from the church, even as survivors fill pews and pulpits. And then from Aisha. The purpose of Love with Accountability, both as a book and a project, is to prioritize, in this case, child sexual abuse, healing, and justice in dialogues, writings, and work on racial justice and sexual violence. Most of the chapters also offer ideas, visions, and strategies for how we can address, disrupt, and ultimately end child sexual abuse without solely relying upon systems that have continually harmed diasporic Black people and other marginalized communities, so the police, incarceration, and so forth. All of the chapters offers insights about the healing journey and what you can look for, what justice can look like for survivors. I was a member of the Shambhala organization from around 2006 until 2019, when I officially left the organization after a series of reports from Project Sunshine came out detailing a long history of sexual violence, alcoholic abuse, physical harm, and other forms of violence for the entire 50+ year history of the organization. The reports also detailed a history of sexual misconduct and abuse and other forms of unethical behavior by the current lineage head, the Kongma Sakyong Mipham Rinpoche, as well as the lineage founder, the Vajradhara Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and the second lineage head, the Vajra regent, Osul Tenzin. So all three lineage heads. But I also want to speak to the ways that sexual violence and abuse was happening at every level. When I was a member of the New York City Shambhala Center, there were many open secrets about men who were creepy, abusive, and inappropriate. In almost every case, these white men held some official position in the center, whether as an employee, a teacher, a major donor, or some other position in which they were untouchable because of power. Often these violations would not be dealt with. Often these violations would be not dealt with, right? They'd be sort of swept aside by having a talk with the person who was the violator or the offender, and almost never, although sometimes this happened, making sure the person who was usually a white woman who was harmed felt truly cared for and felt like she could attend the center and whatever, right? After a while, I moved up in the ranks, training as a teacher, getting authorized as a teacher, and then also holding a position, a volunteer position, unpaid, for a couple of years where I was responsible for the safety and care of the center and community. At least that's how I interpreted it. This involved everything from helping people get to doctor's appointments for chemo, helping people during Hurricane Sandy, people who were homebound, to arranging self-defense and bystander intervention trainings at the center, working on fire safety, being an escort for visiting teachers, whether they were in the Vajrayana tradition or whether they were insight teachers or Zen teachers or other kinds of teachers, and helping to create an additional robust care and conduct process that was beyond what Shambhala International had, and we would launch our own investigations locally. We had a care and conduct team that included psychotherapists, that included lead teachers, and that included myself. When I took the position, those on the care team told me that 80 to 90% of the cases had to do with some form of sexual misconduct and or stalking and harassment. 80 to 90% of the cases. This shocked the shit out of me that there wasn't a more structural response to this pattern, that these incidents were treated as individual incidents or individual people, even if folks were repeat offenders, which there were a number of repeat offenders. So there were two reasons I left the Shambhala organization, although it is still my Buddhist spiritual lineage, even though I have other spiritual lineages and communities of which I'm a part. The first reason I left the Shambhala organization was the ways I experienced or perceived senior teachers, senior students, and donors, major donors, publicly responding to the Project Sunshine reports. Although it was clear that some of the three reports seemed based on rumor or speculation, there was so much overwhelming, credible testimony and research put into detailing the long history of abuses in both the Shambhala organization and in the lineage. I saw survivors, supporters, those who raised concerns and questions being dismissed, silenced, ostracized, and sometimes told to leave. A few senior teachers even said publicly at some of our community meetings that these reports were no big deal, or what had happened, let's say, between the Sakyong or other teachers and students was no big deal. Publicly said that. The second reason I left the organization was that these reports and the subsequent fallout surfaced the most violent aspects of white supremacist violence in the organization, something that was always present, but became very sharp and apparent. For instance, when Black, Indigenous, and people of color, Asian, Pacific Islanders, South Asian, mixed race folks, Latinx people shared their experiences of racist violence and harassment, which for some included sexual and patriarchal violence, we were told to shut up, we were threatened, we were told it wasn't about race, we were lied about, we were called names or told we were injecting something into the conversations that didn't belong. We were told that our concerns about the calls for incarceration ran afoul of our own commitment to abolition. And when we made that, we said that, incarceration wasn't the answer for us, we were told we were supporting abusers. Many BIPOC folks did not feel comfortable or safe sharing their experiences of sexual harassment or sexual violence publicly with white folks in the community because of the ways we were told to have a certain narrative or a certain view or a certain experience of that assault. So people, for instance, who felt violated, but also felt they cared for the teachings, they even cared for the teacher and the lineage, how complicated that was, they were told, no, that's not possible, you're just brainwashed. When we spoke up against the anti-Asian racism directed at Sakyong Mipham Rinpoche, we were told to shut up because we were defending a sexual abuser and a sexual predator. Our whole lives, experiences, analyses, and thoughts were dismissed as simple social justice warrior nonsense. I wrote the following statement on a public Facebook post and Instagram post on January 17th, 2020, about a month after withdrawing financial support for the New York Center. And that was my official, December 2019 was my official leaving of Shambhala. This is what I wrote. What senior internationally known white Buddhist teachers will speak up and resign their positions over the intrinsic white supremacy in almost every predominantly white Western Buddhist Sangha? Who will talk about the abuse of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian folks? Who will talk about the jokes, the sexual ones about our prowess or desirability, or the creepy white people who want to have swinger experiences with us on retreat? Who will talk about the isolation of BIPOC and the rage of white people if we dare point out the interpersonal and structural white supremacy in our communities? Who will resign their position over the smugness of white people asking why they, meaning Black people, have to have their own group? Who will, the Blacks, that's what was said, actually. Who will speak to BIPOC leaders being railroaded, not supported, abused, dismissed, hurt, violated, and used by prominently internationally known peaceful white Dharma teachers? We are not all one. White supremacy has made sure of that. And white people don't get to pull out their Orientalist, we are all one card while perpetuating racial harm and abuse or ignoring it or benefiting from it. Many BIPOC across many lineages and traditions, including white people's beloved insight meditation and spirit rock, have left, not due to sexual assault, or not only due to sexual assaults, but also racist assaults. These assaults get buried. These get co-opted when white people use the language of intersectionality, which is by definition of Kimberly Crenshaw, the violence that Black women and girls face and the erasure of that violence by whites and Black men. It is not about diversity or inclusion, it's about our lives. That's why we have formed our own sanghas, gone underground, we practice together, we practice online, this is before COVID, we form summits for BIPOC, and we leave these traditions. I'm waiting for teachers from Asia, our own teachers many times, and white teachers to address their anti-Blackness and their commitment to white supremacy. But I won't hold my breath. Instead, I'll keep doing work with Black, Indigenous, Asian, Latinx, and mixed race folks to get free. Will you? And then I wrote in a comment, I'm calling all peaceful, high Asian Dharma teachers in India, Tibet, Bhutan, Korea, China, Nepal, Thailand, and elsewhere. And I'm calling on all white Dharma teachers who benefit from Orientalism and white supremacy. What's your Dharma if it's not anti-racist? And finally, and this is sort of in response to the video I made about my experience of anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous at the Open Tory last week. And then the responses that because I didn't talk about sexual abuse in Shambhala, I was a charlatan, a grifter, a predator, and a supporter of predators. The demand that Black people carry our loads, as well as the burdens of white people, is a very old violence in which I absolutely refuse to participate. What have you white folks done publicly to speak out, support, and defend Black folks and other people of color in various sanghas? Even before I left Shambhala, much of my deep Dharma and meditation work was with BIPOC in Shambhala and beyond Shambhala, so people in my neighborhood, people in the community. That has continued uninterrupted. White people have many, many, many teachers who put them first. My orientation is towards Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of the global majority. Thank you.
Thank you, Shante, for sharing your reflections and the writings you've already had shared before. With that, I'd like to turn to Rod to speak about these issues from his own experiences, as well as if he'd like to respond to what Shante was talking about.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I just want to thank all the organizers, Amy and Anne, and all the leaders of this research and organizing for the labor that they've been putting into making this research and this issue a topic of conversation for many of us who have really been struggling in communities of sexual abuse and misuse of power. And I want to thank Shante for your sharing of your experience as well, because there's always a labor involved in sharing our experience, you know, particularly for the most marginalized of us. Like, it's always the heaviest burden for us to express. You know? And I want to just hold space for all of us who are survivors of sexual-based violence, misuse of power within our spiritual communities, those of us who have been abused and manipulated and misled by our teachers, for those of us who have been scapegoated by our communities and have been forced to leave communities and enter into what I call the wilderness, having to give up home because home is no longer safe for us to be in. So holding space for all of us who have experienced some form of violence stemming from the collusion of patriarchy, whiteness, authoritarianism, So as I continue, my name is Lama. I use he, him pronouns. I am living on, again, my homeland, my ancestral land, the Muskogee, lands of the Muskogee and Creek people, the lands that my enslaved ancestors worked and labored on as well after it was taken from the Native American communities by white colonialists. I'm situated on this land and remembering the land of the people, a land that we call Atlanta, Georgia. Now, so as I begin, I just have to just point out one really difficult thing, which is every male teacher, every male Lama that I've ever had in my training, all have been the perpetrators of sexual misconduct and abuse within sanghas. And I will be naming names, particularly the names of those who are public, who we have public record of, and not naming the one name of one teacher who is not public. But I just want to say, to begin with, I started out with Surya Das and the Dzogchen Foundation as a new practitioner. And this was in my mid-20s. And as I continued with the Sangha, I began to hear of experiences that people were having with Surya Das in terms of being pressured into having sexual relationships with. And I had a very close friend in the Sangha who detailed her experiences. And at that point, I decided to address the leadership of the Sangha. And when I did that, I addressed members of the board and had a meeting. And when I did so, I was completely gaslit, and I was told that I was imagining things, that this wasn't true, that women were lying. And of course, this was all white folks, right? I was the only person of African descent in the Sangha, but like very few BIPOC members of the Sangha were actually there. At the time, it was like maybe 5 of us, in the whole like national Sangha. But so I was told that what I was saying was completely, just fiction, And afterwards, I decided to leave that Sangha completely. I was actually told to leave by one of the teachers, a female teacher of that Sangha. And so I left and found myself at Kagyu Tupjing Show in KTC in Wappinger Falls, New York, where I became a student of Lama Norla Rinpoche, who became my group teacher, my Salwe Lama, as we say in the tradition. And eventually I moved to the monastery, lived there, and entered into a 3-year retreat. After completing retreat in 2011, I helped form a teachers council. So all the graduates of 3-year retreat, all the lamas, could start organizing together to support the monastery and to support those of us who were living outside of the monastery. And so my particular role after we formed was to create an ethics statement, a guideline. And so I began to put that ethics statement together, and I had a committee of people. And so as I was doing that, I was informed that Norla Rinpoche had been involved in sexual relationships, unethical sexual relationships with students for years. And one of the survivors of that relationship disclosed that to me. And I was just, heartbroken. I was really upset, And so I kind of went back to the ethics work and continued to do that and presented the work that I'd done to create an ethics statement. And somehow, I don't remember this. I don't know how this started, but somehow I alluded to the fact that we had a history of sexual misconduct in the Sangha. But I don't remember ever saying that at all, but that's what someone heard. And that's what really began the trouble for me. And so when that got out, some of the leaders of the monastery reached out and was like, you really can't talk about this. All the stuff that's happened in the past no longer happens. All of this has been cleared up. We've created boundaries and safeguards to keep this from happening. And so getting that, I made a conscious choice not to pursue any more disruption, as is always in my nature to do so. So I made a choice to kind of back off and to believe, what I'd been told. And then sometime later, it was revealed that as I was told to be quiet, the sexual misconduct was actually continuing, was still happening, and I confirmed that with the person who's also a good friend of mine, who was in relationship with my teacher at the time. So I confirmed that. Later, I confirmed it, but at the time I said, no way, this isn't, I've been lied to, and I really was very triggered. And so after that, that we started a disclosure process, and so everything started coming out, and all the misconduct. It was a community-led process that was headed by an olive branch, and they kind of headed that up and did the interviews and the research and did the disclosure. And I just had a lot of issues with the whole process, with the disclosures. But in general, what I really struggled with was that no one was held accountable. So Nola Rinpoche, the only thing he did was offer a video apology. And that was it. So no one left their positions, no one was demoted, nothing was changed, nothing happened. And when we tried to kind of reform the Teachers Council, we were all split. There were those of us who felt like there needed to be more accountability, and there were the other half that just wanted to protect the status quo, which for me meant creating the causes. Well, it meant continuing the causes and conditions that created the harm to begin with. And so having kind of experienced that resistance to change, I made a choice to leave and no longer affiliate with the monastery. And as is in my fashion, I decided to disrupt the whole situation by writing a chapter in my latest book called Me Too and the Guru. And then afterwards, I just kind of, before the writing, I just kind of started doing a lot of public teaching around misconduct, patriarchy, whiteness, and just my experiences around this. I would also say too that I've in the past been trained formally as a sexual assault advocate. And I went through that training in my hometown in my early 20s. So I come from that history, of being within this field and knowing some of the language, and the issues associated with it. And I also, at this point, the third teacher that I want to name is the Karmapa, as well, who, for legal reasons, I want to say allegedly, was involved in sexual misconduct, fathered a child, allegedly, and is currently being sued in Canada by the survivor of that relationship. And I know that has completely disrupted many practitioners again, but at this point, I just kind of expected. You know, my training has been with Tibetans, and it's been, you know, being embedded in Tibetan communities in India and Nepal. And what I understand just from my experience is that, you know, abuse is kind of, you know, breaded into the culture, and in such a way that it becomes normalized, that this is what we do. When I think about tulkus or rinpoches, you know, the system is inherently cruel, you know, where young children are recognized as reincarnated lamas. They're taken out of their childhood, adolescent development, and propelled into this training structure, which is meant to speed them through adolescent development into adulthood so they can be reseated and rethroned, you know, and that indoctrination process, however, there is a vulnerability that opens for them to be abused, both physically and sexually, mentally, by those around them. So you have these Rinpoches now who are themselves survivors of misconduct, who are also more prone to enact misconduct on those around them. I often say, you know, I'm just going to like be really, you know, just direct about this. I don't really have anything to lose anymore. But, you know, it's just like you're studying with these really realized masters, but they're also little boys at the same time. And sometimes you have to be like, no, you can't do that. Like, you can't touch me like that. Like, you can't say that. You know, there's a disconnect because of the training that they had to go through. And they don't have the language to articulate the impact of abuse, because it's culture. It becomes culture. You know, this is just what we do. This is what we experience, right? And so then the boundaries are erased or blurred when they come to context, like, you know, Western context, right? And there's also, you know, I want to speak just a little bit about what I experienced in terms of like the coming together, the conversions of Tibetan authoritarianism and white supremacy within Tibetan Vajrayana communities, because they go hand in hand, they feed off each other. You know, whiteness and white supremacy loves hierarchy, authority. White practitioners who come into Dharma, who are trying to distance themselves from the violence of white supremacy, will do that by assimilating into Tibetan culture, which is just a replacement of the same authoritarianism. You know, so it begins to get mixed up in a way that I felt really pushed out. You know, I felt squeezed out of the community. I just felt erased, you know, particularly as someone coming in with a radical, like, abolitionist mindset who's already suspicious of authority, you know, and I just couldn't, you know, be well anymore in those communities. You know, I'm often the first Black Lama anyone has ever met. I'm not the only Black Lama, but I'm usually the first. I'm usually the first because I kind of, through a series of different things, I kind of bypassed the hierarchy of my tradition and just started teaching out in the world. You know, and started building community and building collaborations and eventually coming into radical Dharma, you know, and so those paths out of the community saved me, you know, from the harm of being in these communities. My colleagues and friends who are still very much associated with these communities, particularly with KTC, who changed his name now it's Palpong, Tupching Sholing, PTC. My colleagues, my white colleagues, many of them refuse to take a stance because they are dependent on the resources of the monastery, whereas I have created other ways to be sustained outside of the community. You know, so when I say I don't have anything to lose, I don't really have much more to lose. But I decided to write this chapter in Love and Rage. And, you know, people were very nervous. You know, a couple of friends were really nervous for me. And I want to speak to something particular about Tibetan, Vajrayana, Tantra communities, which is this belief that if you criticize the Lama or create discord in the Sangha, then that's really bad karma. And that keeps people silent. And basically I said, fuck it. So if I'm going to go to the hell realm for speaking truth and trying to heal and trying to create inclusive, healthy, safe communities, then this Buddhism thing is the wrong thing for me to be doing. If that's the situation, you know, and there are so many other lamas, Western lamas, who are so terrified of speaking about the harm, not just sexual misconduct, but other forms of ethical misconduct that they've experienced, because they feel as if it's going to have this intense negative karmic repercussion. And it creates mental health disparities for people. And I just, you know, as I want to hold space for them, those, you know, those folks who just feel like they can't say anything because, you know, they believe that they will hurt the Sangha and create obstacles for people getting access to the Dharma, you know. But the Dharma of disruption is Dharma. You know, like this is still truth that needs to be articulated, you know. But you know, there are people that I love in the tradition, again, that I love and I just really care for, who have lost a sense of integrity. You know, you can't say that you're about the liberation of all beings and then say, well, you know, you really can't talk about abuse. You know, you can't talk about the racism, you can't talk about the patriarchy. You know, and I'm creating distance between those people because, like, I want to practice a Dharma of liberation, not of repression and silence. You know, so I will end there. And it's something that Shante mentioned that we're going to have to get into is, you know, anti-Blackness, you know, and Asian teachers and Asian communities. Because I think as Black teachers, the criticism that we get is that, you know, well, you know, what is something is I get so much feedback from the world though. Like, it's like, well, aren't you, you know, why are you doing the things that you're doing? Why are you leaving these communities and doing things that are on outside of the guidance of your Tibetan teachers? And I say, well, because of the anti-Blackness that no one wants to talk about, you know, like, and I see that anti-Blackness in Asian communities happening on a larger scale in terms of the violence against Asian communities, you know, that we have to talk about the ways in which anti-Blackness has created distance, you know, between Black folks and Asian communities, Asian folks, that's what we have to bridge. And the same thing is happening in Asian Sanghas as well. It's like, it's hard for me to be in all Asian Sanghas because I feel that, like, why are you here? You know, and I feel the same thing with white dominated Sanghas. It's like, why are you here? You know, and so taking all of that into account, I choose to go elsewhere and build communities around this vision of true inclusivity, you know, and liberation, you know. So I'll just stop there because I think I'm going on too much.
No, thank you so much for sharing those, both of you, and really speaking of the labor that's going into this, the emotional and political labor, the care work that's involved in addressing these issues. We have about 10 minutes remaining, so I don't know if we have a lot of time to discuss it more deeply, but it's a topic, it's a theme that just came up with what you were saying, Rod, as well as what Shante was sharing. Well, my question is, it's related to this issue of anti-Blackness and in the relationship to issues of anti-Blackness within Asian communities. So there's a conversation right now about critiquing patriarchal systems in Buddhism that are often undergirded by sexual abuse while taking care not to reproduce colonial discourses, such as reproducing racist tropes of Orientalism and civilizational discourse, while at the same time confronting sexual abuse. How can we avoid reproducing colonial rhetoric when naming, for instance, Tibetan patriarchy, but also at the same time, how is this work related to labor towards anti-Blackness, labor against resisting anti-Blackness within Asian communities and traditions?
I mean, I don't, it's a big question. One of the things
we
I
have
really,
10 minutes left.
yeah,
So.
one of the things I really start with was what is my complicity in this whole system, right? So, in the, about a couple of years when I was actually going to take, I mean, this is a little circuitous, so please bear with me. When I was going to take Vajrayana vows, I actually felt very resistant. I was like, the Mahayana's dope, the Hinayana's great, but I was being encouraged to become a Vajrayana student. I have to say I had a very heartfelt connection to the Sakyong, like very strong, much stronger than with Trungpa Rinpoche, which was very unusual. People felt usually very close to Trungpa Rinpoche, but as soon as I walked into Shambhala Center in 2006, I felt some connection. And but I had studied with some other Tibetan teachers, and particularly Khandra Rinpoche was very vocally critical of Shambhala and the kind of arrogance, right? And that's what I saw from the New York Center. Had a lot, it was one of the oldest and one of the largest centers of Shambhala, and had a lot of tantric practitioners, and most of them to me seemed absolutely unkind and just downright mean. And I thought, is that what Vajrayana means? I mean, what did I know, right? Is that what it means? You're either like a sweet, bald-headed Lama, or you're like a mean white rich person. And my meditation instructor at the time said, just go and see what happens. And like, so I went, I had this incredible experience, I took, first part of Samaya. And then in the next year, I remember asking a good friend of mine, I think I've said this elsewhere, but I can't remember if this information is public or not, so I won't name this name, but someone who was an Acharya, is no longer an Acharya, a lineage holder, and who left that position. And as he said to me, that person had to die. So that was interesting. But I asked him specifically, I said, it was right after I remember reading about reading Rod's, Lama Rod's piece, something on Facebook about his teacher, Sogyo Rinpoche, the stuff about Sogyo Rinpoche had come out. And then there was another Western insight teacher, something happened. I think it was a teacher who had overdosed on opiates. And I remember asking this teacher who I really trusted, I said, is there anything I need to know about the Sakyong? And he said these words, he's clean. Mm. Now, maybe that meant he's cleaned up his act in the last 5 years, but it didn't, I felt, just give us the information and let us decide. I don't know what decision I would have made had I known the Sakyong's history, because the way it was set up in Shambhala, to me, at least from my experience, was that Chogyam Rinpoche was a little wild. He was a Mahasiddha. Drinking and the 10 wives and the cocaine and everything. But the Sakyong's completely different. So, I was a little naive. I didn't ask, well, how is he different? What work did he do? What, how has that been expressed? And so there was a kind of narrative that was saying like, and I think he had cleaned up his act, that's for sure, but he wasn't clean. And so I think for me, there was a whole sense of, and it was like, I mean, I was told like, don't ask these questions too loudly, lest they get back to the court and you be, whatever. Mm-hmm. And I think, one of the things that, in terms of your question, is like, the first thing I really laid at the feet of the teachers who are from Asia. Mm-hmm. And, Trungpa Rinpoche came here and he cultivated white, wealthy people as his audience. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what it looks like from the outside. I don't know what it was like on the inside. I was the child when he died, but I talked to the people who were, the Black and Asian folks who were there in those early days. And they're like, I was, a handful of us, and we all know each other. And so the teachers, they know there's wealth, they know there's money, and they don't even go to other Asian students, right? They don't go to to Queens, and there are all these ethnic Asian Buddhist communities in Queens. They go to Manhattan or they go wherever. So there's that. I really laid at their feet. I understand it's a patronage model, but just say that. So they're cultivating these audiences of a particular kind of white person too. There were white people who left Shambhala in New York Center because they were like, I have to save money to take the round trip subway ride here. And when I get here, everyone's talking about being on their iPhones, right? And that yun or like practices of enrichment are always material. It's never about spiritual enrichment or enriching presence or relationships. So I think the teachers, so that's one thing. And then I think the, at least in the Shambhala context, these people felt blessed. They felt like they had the thing. I felt it too, you know? There is something special about all the communities we belong to, right? It's why we belong to them. But there was this arrogance of don't look. And the last thing I'll say on that was when I was on this open Tory retreat, where I both did workshops and I taught, and then I was a participant, what I kept saying was, oh, I understand the story of Lot's wife from the Bible now. So it's misogynistic, but she looks back after they leave Sodom and Gomorrah because they leave, it's like, oh, they're gay. No, part of one interpretation is because in hospitality, they turn them away. They turn these travelers away. And she is like, fuck that. I'm not go. There's room and there's board. And she turns to a pillar of salt. And I was like, oh, right. You can't, there's no going back. And holding, I will say for me, it's been very hard. I mean, Lama Rod has heard me complain, talk about Shambhala ad nauseum. And it really wasn't until a few months ago that I felt some kind of softening toward my experience and the experience of others. And it was like, you can't go back. That door is shut. And also holding my root guru, like my root guru is abuse people. And then there was a window where he was listening to people. I had the opportunity to talk to him on Zoom. Other people were talking to him and like, you can do this. You can like make amends. You can go deep. This is, we're saying you have to amend this because it's not just, you did harm individuals sexually and also you're biting people, whatever the fuck, I don't know. But allegedly, I guess I should say, but also you harmed the entire community. And there was a little window of a few months and then it was, this speculation about why this is having to do with what Lama Rod talked about, the culture, and he married into a family that's a high Buddhist, tantric Buddhist culture. And then it was closed, that door, and it was like, I said, sorry, it's over. So, I think, white folks also have to think about, why do I want to be involved in a community that's all white? And it takes someone saying it's all white, except for maybe the lineage head. And what is it about that dynamic that feels so comfortable? And when people begin to bring up, when Black people particularly, but not only Black people, Asian folks bring up the violence that they're experiencing, we experience more violence. So I also, sorry, one more thing. I think also a lot, I don't know if this was true for you, Lama Ra, but in Shambhala context, and this even happened at this open Tory thing, people kept invoking the analogy of family. I thought it was so dangerous because families are often not safe.
Yeah.
And I think besides family, assault inside families, assault inside spiritual communities is probably one of them because there's so much trust. Yeah. And I even said to Ashoka, who's like the white part of the Mukpo family, I said, we're all experiencing the karma of the Mukpo family drama. It's writ large now. We're all experiencing your fucking drama of the families, and the conflict and the who holds this and the who has power and who has material. And that invocation of family without the ways that families can also be sites of violence, to me, was very telling of how organized Buddhism often views itself. No training. Like Rod, I also worked for a long time in domestic violence communities and around with rape, with survivors and perpetrators. And that work was very hard and very deep. And it wasn't just a couple of trainings, but it had to do with undoing things that were baked into the culture. And so baked into, my lineage is sexual violence, white supremacy, violent patriarchy, and incredible classism, and colonial attitudes. Trump Rinpoche wanted people to go colonize Halifax.
Mhm.
So I didn't answer your question, but I think those are some of the dynamics that, and I'm also holding all the my own hurt, right? Which I don't often express, because when I'm teaching, it's not that I can't talk about my hurt, but it's like I'm usually trying to hold space for other people's hurt. But holding my own feelings of betrayal, holding my own feelings of, staying in a place that was consistently not welcoming and was very violent, that used me, allowed myself to be used. I kept believing there was no other way to get the teachings that I valued, and bringing other people into the community. So.
Okay, I'm aware of the time, and we want to make some room for Q&A. But Rod, do you want to add anything at this point?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything Shante is sharing, and there's a story that I want to quickly relate. And there's a very famous, well-known Tibetan teacher, Lama, who was giving a talk with a large sangha here in the States, not Shambhala, but another large Tibetan Western Sangha. And in that talk, the room was full of people, maybe hundreds of people. In that talk, he said that Black people do not have the merit to practice Buddhism. And I have a really good Dharma friend, sister, also a Black woman, who was there, and she reached out to me and was like, "You won't believe what this Lama just heard." A Lama that I've sat with just said, and I was like, that's the prevailing attitude, because Tibetan Buddhism came into this country through whiteness, through white class money, like upper class money, right, and influence that shut out a lot of us from having access to those spaces. And of course, these Tibetan teachers, having their first exposure to America, being white moneyed folks, would think that other folks, didn't have access to Dharma. Now, in my community, KTC, the Chinese Sangha was huge. And they were extremely moneyed, extremely present, and an active part of the Sangha, right? Who also competed with white folks for influence and positionality within the Sangha. That created even more of a tension, So to say that, and to say also that in Sanghas and in the general kind of social fabric, particularly of this country, I think a lot of Asian American folks, be them teachers, practitioners, and so forth, have to ask themselves how they've participated in their proximity to whiteness, because that has created the anti-Blackness. It's like, well, we're not Black. And that has created like this phenomena of the model minority, and we have to disrupt that. Like we all have a part in disrupting, that, particularly within sanghas, but in general, like we don't have critical race theory happening. We barely have it happening in the world now, but let alone like in sanghas, people don't have the language, because it's all just Dharma. We're just all here to get free. We're all just here to practice wisdom and compassion, and I was like, well, and wisdom and compassion means that we're also dismantling systems of harm. They're perpetuating themselves, and no one wants to hear that because that's uncomfortable. And white supremacy doesn't do discomfort, and so then as Sarah Ahmed has said, when you begin to articulate the problem, you become the problem, right? And that's been a lot of our experience, I'm sure with Shante as well. It's like when you start articulating that there's a problem, and all of a sudden you're the problem, you know? And so I was like, fine, you know, forget it. I'm no longer a reformist in the Buddhist communities. You know, I'm not here to come and like do anti-race, you know, oppression training. I'm not here to give like the race talk anymore. You know, I just can't do that anymore because it's just pointless. It's not my work, you know? And so I prefer to create new ways of thinking about Dharma, practicing Dharma, creating new ways to be in community that are essentially abolitionist, anti-oppression, you know, inclusive, gender expansive and expressive, all of that. And it's an experiment. It's an experiment. It looks real messy right now, but it's still, it looks like an experiment that's always on the verge of falling apart. But like that's the Dharma though. Like it should be practiced in this way where you're like, okay, I don't know what's coming next, but I know what's happening now and what I'm trying to do. So that's it. This is what I would share. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I always appreciate a reference to Sarah Ahmed, and that that response of that comment about being the problem when you raise a problem. That's the issue that comes over and over again, even in my own research and my fieldwork. So really resonates. So I'm going to switch over to the Q&A now and open it up for the people in the audience. And so, and this question is kind of because JoAnna's not here with us, so we recognize that the conversation is kind of centered around Shambhala today. And there are so many other stuff, there's been so many other incidents and events that have proceeded in other communities. But having the two of you here speak, one of the questions that has come up is there any value to be salvaged in organizations such as Shambhala, or is the well poisoned by abuse of power, sexual abuse, patriarchy, and white supremacy? Rod, you ended in a sense with that gesturing towards that response to that in terms of creating new communities, but that's a question from the audience, and maybe Shante or Rod, either of you want to speak to that.
I think my own personal experience is that the work that I want to do, particularly working with Black folks, diasporic Black folks, doesn't need to happen inside of an organization, and that it's important that there are so many barriers to access, first of all, to that. I think about how expensive my teacher training was and how expensive and inaccessible most retreats have been. So, you know, being able to work with small groups, work with students one-on-one, offer things for free or for very low cost or whatever is really valuable to me. And the model that I've seen for most sanghas is that there's so many barriers in terms of just pay, mm-hmm. And time and language and not explaining things. And at the same time, I have people I really trust and who are really radical, like people of color and white folks who are involved in their local context. So I think that's one thing is, I don't know about the big organization. I have some contact with people in their local context, and they're just doing that work. What they have found is that they can't do that radical work inside the center. They had to actually make their own platform. So I think the answer is no, from my perspective. Other people who are still involved might say yes. My curiosity, the reason for going on this retreat was I wanted to see what was possible when people who weren't, well, some people I think were still part of the organization, but when people were coming from different places, what could happen when we gathered? And we reproduced a lot of the same structural problems. Again, it wasn't, as far as I have heard, I haven't heard anything about sexual violence, but the same kind of unexplained hierarchies, white racist bullshit, feel-goodism, avoiding direct talk conversations about excuses for people's, lineage holders or anyone's behavior. No, I think I was the first one when I gave my talk on Sunday to publicly invoke survivors. So nothing, and I've talked with the organizers about this. Some of them are on this call, and, it wasn't anything malicious, but it was like, we almost went back into a kind of, robotic something. And there were lots of good conversations I had, and there were people doing amazing things, but many people, including myself, came out feeling like small, liberatory, free, creative, and the Buddha said, listen to no one, not even, trust not my words, not even my words, test them for yourself. And so just space where there's, I don't know. Some people are in organizations where they feel held, and I think that's important. I'm not, you know what I mean? But I have 2 teachers who hold me, and that feels important. I have Dharma siblings and Vajra siblings who hold me, and that feels important. And I have the Dharma. And I have other communities, other spiritual communities and other kinds of communities that feel, it doesn't have to be one thing, I'm like, wisdom comes from tarot cards. If it comes from crystals, I got Harriet Tubman right here. I got Africa right here. It's not about reproducing something that's not in my cultural context. And I think that if the place I'm in says you can't ask questions, or asking those type of questions means you're not loyal, that's not something I, can be a part of.
And I think another part of this is that we have to name that there's a fair amount of Dharma communities that are actually cults, and that's a whole nother kind of like field of study that I know I've had to get fluent in. I never consider myself a survivor of a cult until I began to study former communities and within the research of cults. I was like, oh, that's what this is. And it just all makes sense to me. It's not the Dharma isn't the problem. It's the ways in which we fail to embody the Dharma, right? And we fail because, for many reasons, but we will definitely fail if we don't have the support of a community who's holding us accountable, right? And when that doesn't happen, then everyone's going to fail. Everyone's going to struggle to really embody liberation. So, for me, it's like, I don't believe a Dharma organization should last forever. And I think that many of us are really invested in longevity of communities that actually should just be let go, and allowed to evolve, to change, to die out. And I think that's one of the things that's happening with Shambhala. If people could just let it go, and, instead of just kind of like holding on to his resurrection, just let it go and let something new evolve. And the same thing with my monastery, which, no matter what, to the very last, ounce of resource, they're going to be pumping into that community to keep it going and not changing anything. Because there is this conflation of physical buildings with like the proliferation of Dharma. It's like, if you don't have a physical thing, then how can there be Dharma happening, right? And we have to disrupt that. Like a building doesn't mean that you're special, or a temple or stupa, or like a 60-foot Buddha, like whatever it is, like doesn't make you special. It means that you have money to build a temple and a big Buddha.
And I imagine if JoAnna was here, she could probably speak to that too, in relation to Against the Stream. And they did dissolve, and the institution does, that institution no longer exists in the way it did. Yeah. There's one more, maybe you can have one more question here. The question is, how can we continue to call these Buddhist leaders fully realized? Fully realized in what way?
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
How can we continue to call these Buddhist leaders fully realized? Fully realized in what way?
Yeah. Well, I would like to speak to this just a little bit because this is what I'm writing on for my next book. And I think that part of what we struggle with is that we just misunderstand enlightenment, you know, and that enlightenment becomes somehow the eradication of ego, and that's not what happens. You know, that's not part of Buddhist philosophy. Enlightenment doesn't mean it doesn't mean the erasure of ego. It means the realization of ego. You know, so when one is fully realized, there's still a proximity to ego, right? A realized being has to stay in proximity to ego in order to communicate with us, to be a teacher, right? And that's where the risk is. You know, there's also the shadow persists when we're in a relationship to the ego. So we may have complete clarity in one part of our lives, but then there's a shadow, right? And that takes a different kind of effort. Enlightenment doesn't mean that everything gets light. It means that, like, you have, you know, the methods and the resources you have been realized. And so you can, like, move deeply into some of these issues to bring wisdom, you know, and compassion into it. But
yeah, I think that was so beautiful, Rod. I always think about the Buddha Shakyamuni himself, who it took 12 years, it is said, for him to let women, his wife and his mother, into the Sangha, the Buddha, right? Could not see past this cultural context of patriarchy. And even then, even though one was an arhat and one of them was an arhat, one was a greatly realized practitioner and teacher, they had to bow down to the lowest, newest novice male monk. So even the Buddha himself had some blind spots. And I think also, to me, enlightened, or someone who's able to really point out the clarity of mind, you know, my own clarity of mind, give out pointing instructions or whatever, I have to remember that's also a human being. And what kind of human training have they done is a question to ask. You know, one of the things I really like about working with Lama Rod and Lama Justin is, one of the things I modeled after Lama Rod is, when he starts working with a student, he sends an ethics statement to his student about what his ethics are, you know, and I updated my statement. So it's like, this is what this relationship is. These are the things I promise in terms of how to behave. If I ever step out of line, here's what you can do. And also, what do you have to add? What make you feel relatively safe in this? And I think sometimes teachers, whether they're in Vajrayana or they're Mahayana teachers or they're in Theravada, and they feel like they have to have this I'm perfect vibe.
And yeah, and that's a part of white supremacy, right? It's like that perfection, or that ideal of perfection.
Yes.
Thank you. So the last most voted question is, what can you tell outsiders looking into Buddhism who are now questioning their faith after witnessing supremacist and abusive behaviors in Buddhist sanghas?
Well, I just want to say that one of the deepest pains to me is the way that these lineage holders or these teachers have driven people away from the Dharma. I mean, that to me is what lands you in Vajra hell, you know, is that these people have driven people away through their abuse and or silence and or whatever, rigidity. And that, I don't know, it's just like so painful. And, you know, it makes sense. What I will say from my own experience, I grew up in the Pentecostal church, and the church I grew up in was a very, it was international, and it had a very charismatic bishop who died when I was very, very young. And I was like, I've seen some parallels. And that people like kept invoking him years, and it's like a family dynasty. So his grandson is now the bishop of the, or the, you know, pastor of the church or whatever. But, you know, the sexual violence was so insane in that church. I mean, it was wild. The child sexual assault was incredible, right? And I mean, it just was rampant. And when I started exploring at a very young age, maybe 12 or 13 different religions, which felt like really scary because I was told, you know, this is the only way. You don't even go to Baptist church because they're wrong, or definitely not Catholics. So when I started reading about, you know, at 12, 13, Hinduism and Judaism and Islam and Buddhism, I think, you know, initially, and when I started practicing at 16, I was looking for an escape, like close the door on that, move to the next thing. And I remember a friend of mine who was a Ifa priestess, you know, traditional African religion, said, you can't, because I was like, oh, what about Yoruba? What about, and she's like, you can't join this thing until you integrate and make peace with how you grew up, what spiritual tradition you grew up in. So I think that what I have been doing is working with trusted teachers, mostly because as a teacher, I don't believe in being a teacher without a teacher. So I need that kind of responsibility, and working with, you know, students, and then practicing with siblings, you know, kind of having a more horizontal, the discomfort of being in the diaspora, being ejected from something that was very clear. I go on retreat this many times a year and I do this, and on Tuesday nights I teach this, and into much more unknown. And if the Dharma, if the words of the Buddha or the words of particular teachers that have come after him feel like they're helpful to you, or if meditation itself feels helpful to you, don't give that up. You know, don't let someone's violence drive you out of your own experience of wisdom and sanity, because we have sanity, right, that we can touch into through our practice. And also through, you know, it's like, I don't just have Buddhist teachers, I have a somatic psychotherapist, and I have, you know, all kinds of help to help me also remain a human who's trying to, on a very relative level, be of service. And it may be that it's not being part of an organization, but maybe it's just finding some friends to meditate with and read some books with. And then maybe you'll hear someone that you feel relatively safe with, and you can study with them.
Thank you. I know we're approaching time, so I'm not sure if the organizers want to jump into, but Rod, yeah.
Just quickly, this is not so much addressing the question, but I think there's one last thing that I just want to point out, and it's a nuance that I think that probably Shante and I have been accused of, which is, again, I think a function of anti-Blackness, when we've been accused of not coming out harder against the teachers who create, you know, this violence. And for us, you know, and I think that there is this easy way in which Black people are blamed really easily and scapegoated. But secondly, there's also this bypassing of the nuance that we're talking about here, which I've been very clear about, which is that my teachers have created, well, I'm speaking specifically of Northern Rinpoche now, has created a lot of violence, but he saved my life at the same time. And I think there's so much trauma and anger in our communities that we can't figure out this middle way. We can't see that, but that's indicative of the times that we're living in. We're all, you know, we're all on opposite ends of the spectrum, you know, but for me, my practice is always going to be to remember the kindness of the Lama and remembering the harm that the Lama has done, both together, you know. So if people can't get with that, I'm sorry, but that's where I'm at and will continue to be.
Yeah, and there are a lot of other people you can like study to. I always tell people, you know, sometimes people say, why do you say the Sakyong Rinpoche is your root teacher? So people can make a decision for some people, they're like, no way, that's a hard line. I'm not trying to lie to people. I'm not trying to fool people. I'm like, I haven't studied with him in 3 years. I have no plans to study with him unless he makes amends and does a whole bunch of stuff. But I want people to know that that's, and you know, how, you know, I won't get into the weirdness of how I try to send him messages with my mind, but you know, it's like, get your fucking act together, right? But it's like, I want people to be able to make decisions, you know, and if, you know, and it's like, people were like, oh, some people are bullying you online and on Reddit and are calling you, and I'm like, I don't care. That's what I'm here to say both end, right? And I'm here to say, like, this is my experience. And people have to protect themselves the ways that feel safe for them. And so I always, you never have to listen to a word I say. I'm not, and also I want to say, call on these white teachers. What are they saying publicly? Why aren't you pitchforking them? What are they doing?
Exactly.
And my practice, my Dharma practice, my relationship to the ancestors, to training as an ancestor, or you can call it a bodhisattva, call it training as an ancestor, is not bound to Shambhala. It's not even bound to my root guru. It's bound to the truth. Yes. It's bound to liberation. And so I don't want to keep talking about, I've exhausted what I have to say about that. I'm not exhausted what I want to say about sexual abuse or whiteness or whatever, but that's not, keeping a wound open so that people see I have a wound is not a way to heal for me. Right? And so, you know, it's not that I don't care. It's not any of that. It's like, I'm actually trying to do something in my life for my own sanity that's not bound to an organization or even bound to a lineage, but that's really about what can we do right now with each other that's toward liberation, that's liberatory.
Thank you, Shante. Thank you. On to the organizers.
Well, we are up on time, and we just want to express our really sincere gratitude for both Lama Rod and Shante for joining us today, and also Nali for coming and helping to moderate. So much gratitude for that too. And thank you everybody who attended the event, and thank you for your questions. And hopefully we will see you next month at our next event. I forget the date. Anne, do you remember the date?
Sorry, it's in September.
Well, we'll be advertising it.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, yeah, I think it was just some really powerful words at the end. So I think it's good to end on those powerful words from Shante. So thanks everyone, and we hope to see you for our next conversation. We hope the conversation was of benefit to all beings, just as a little dedication there. Okay, bye everyone.
Bye. Thank you.